My parents always wanted a boy and convinced my husband. Everyone left me because I couldn't give them a grandson. When we unexpectedly met on the street, they were shocked. I haven't spoken to my parents or my ex-husband, Ryan, in 3 years. 3 years of silence, of cutting off the toxic influences that had slowly poisoned my life. When I moved out to the suburbs after the divorce, it was like a breath of fresh air after years of suffocating. No more tense phone calls, no more awkward family dinners where I sat silently, trying to find common ground that didn't exist. It was a clean slate, a chance to rebuild myself from the ruins of what had been a life ruled by the expectations of others. Growing up, I was always aware that my parents had wanted a son. They never outright said it, but I felt it in the small ways that added up over the years. They weren't cruel, exactly. They provided for me, made sure I was taken care of. But there was this undeniable sense that I didn't quite meet their expectations. My father, in particular, seemed distant, like he was holding out for something I could never be. I was their only child, and in their eyes, I was enough to keep their lives moving forward, but I was never really the person they envisioned standing beside them. Despite that, I stayed in touch with them. I think it was mostly out of obligation. Family is family, right? At least, that's what I told myself. There's a certain emptiness that comes with the realization that the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally are merely tolerating you. And I held on to that emptiness for years, letting it shape me, letting it guide my decisions. That's how I ended up meeting Ryan. Ryan and I met at a concert. One of those random moments where you bump into someone, strike up a conversation, and then somehow, before you know it, your lives become intertwined. He was charming, charismatic, everything my parents had hoped I would find. For the first time, they seemed genuinely interested in what was going on in my life when I introduced him to them. It was like their disappointment in me faded away, replaced by their fascination with Ryan. I think they saw him as some kind of redemption, like if I couldn't give them what they wanted, maybe he could. We dated for 3 years, and it wasn't long before my parents started nudging me toward marriage. They loved him, of course, and I was swept up in the idea that this was it. This was the thing that would finally make them happy, make me feel like I'd done something right in their eyes. So, we got married. It was a beautiful ceremony, the kind you dream about as a little girl, with flowers, music, and everything perfectly in place. For a while, I convinced myself that life was falling into place, that this was how things were supposed to be. 6 months into our marriage, the pressure to start a family began. My parents, especially my mother, were relentless. It was subtle at first, questions about whether we were thinking about having kids, if we were ready to settle down for real. But soon, it became more than just gentle prodding. They wanted grandkids. My father, who had always been more aloof, suddenly seemed to have an opinion about everything, including my reproductive timeline. It was overwhelming. At first, I wasn't sure if I was ready. Ryan and I hadn't really talked about kids before the wedding. But after hearing the constant barrage from my parents, we decided to give it a shot. That's when things started to fall apart. Months passed, and nothing happened. We tried everything, tracking cycles, following every piece of advice we could find. But still, nothing. It was frustrating, and I felt like my body was betraying me. After a year of trying, we decided to see a doctor, and that's when I learned the truth. I was infertile. The news hit me like a freight train, but it wasn't just the realization that I couldn't have children. It was the knowledge that I was about to disappoint everyone who had ever pressured me into this role. When I told my parents, their reactions were colder than I could have imagined. My father barely said anything. He just sat there, staring at me like I'd somehow failed him. My mother's disappointment was palpable, and she tried to hide it, but her words cut through me like a knife. "I guess it just wasn't meant to be," she said, but it wasn't sympathy, it was resignation. From that moment on, their calls became less frequent. Their visits stopped altogether. I had been their last hope for a continuation of their family legacy, and in their eyes, I had let them down. I tried to brush it off, to focus on my life with Ryan, but it hurt more than I let on. It wasn't just the infertility. It was the realization that my parents had only cared about me as a means to an end. Without the possibility of children, I was no longer of any use to them. I thought, Maybe Ryan would understand that we could figure it out together, but things between us began to shift too. At first, Ryan was supportive. He held me when I cried, told me that it didn't matter, that we could adopt or find another way to build a family. But as time went on, that support started to fade. He became distant, throwing himself into his work, spending more and more time away from home. I knew what was happening, but I didn't want to admit it to myself. Our marriage was unraveling, slowly but surely, and I was powerless to stop it. The final straw came when I confronted my parents about how they had treated me. I was tired of feeling like an outsider in my own family, tired of the constant pressure to be something I wasn't. I told them that I didn't want to maintain the relationship anymore, that their indifference and the pressure they had put on me had become too much. I expected some pushback, maybe even an apology. But instead, my father looked me in the eye and said, "If you can't even give us grandchildren, what's the point?" It was like being punched in the gut. That was it, the end of our relationship. And so, I cut them off. I cut off Ryan too, eventually. It wasn't just the infertility that broke us. It was everything. The years of pretending, the weight of expectations, the realization that I had spent so much of my life trying to please people who would never be satisfied. Moving to the suburbs after the divorce was like stepping into a new world, one where I could finally breathe again. It was quiet, peaceful, and for the first time in my life, I felt free. But the silence? It's heavy. 3 years later, and I still carry the echoes of everything I left behind. I don't think I realized how quickly everything with Ryan was unraveling. At first, I chalked it up to stress. We had just gone through months of trying to conceive, only to be met with the crushing news that it wasn't going to happen. That kind of thing messes with your head, with your marriage. I thought we were grieving together, working through it in our own ways. But slowly, I began to see that Ryan was pulling away. Not just emotionally, but physically too. He stopped coming home on time. We used to have these little routines, having dinner together, watching a movie, just sitting in the same room. But as the weeks went on, those moments became fewer and fewer. He started staying late at work or going out with friends, and when he was home, he would spend hours locked away in his office. The man who used to hold me and tell me we could get through anything together was suddenly so distant, like he was a stranger living in the same house. I tried to talk to him, to figure out what was going on, but every time I brought it up, he brushed me off. He'd say he was just busy, that work was demanding, and that he needed space to process everything. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think that this was just a rough patch and that we'd come out the other side stronger. But deep down, I knew something had changed between us. The love we had, the connection, it was slipping away, and I couldn't hold on to it. It wasn't long after we decided to put the idea of having a child on hold that he filed for divorce. It felt sudden, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe I had just been blind to the signs. He didn't give much of an explanation when he told me he wanted out. He said it was for personal reasons, that he needed to figure things out for himself. But there was a coldness in his eyes, a detachment that scared me. It was like he had already moved on in his mind, and I was just the last loose end he needed to tie up. The divorce was quick and clean, legally speaking. There wasn't much to fight over. We didn't have kids, and the house was in both of our names, so we split it and went our separate ways. But emotionally, I was wrecked. I felt like I had failed. Failed as a wife, failed as a daughter, failed as a person. I had lost not only my marriage, but also the last shreds of connection with my family. It was a few weeks after the divorce was finalized when I learned the truth. My cousin, Emily, called me one night, and after some awkward small talk, she hesitantly dropped the bombshell. Ryan had been living with my parents. At first, I couldn't believe it. Why would my parents take him in? But as Emily told me more, it became clear. My parents had never really cared about my happiness. They had only cared about what I could give them, grandchildren, a family legacy. And when I couldn't do that, they sided with Ryan. They thought he deserved better, that he deserved a life with someone who could give him the children I couldn't. The betrayal hit me like a ton of bricks. My parents, the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, had taken in my ex-husband and turned their backs on me. It was like everything I had ever feared growing up, that I wasn't good enough, that I didn't matter, was being confirmed. I was disposable to them, just as I had been to Ryan. I was nothing more than a failed expectation. I blocked all of them after that. My parents, Ryan, everyone. I couldn't bear the thought of them in my life anymore. Knowing what they had done, I needed to heal, to move on, and the only way I could do that was by cutting ties with the people who had caused me so much pain. In the months after the divorce, I threw myself into rebuilding my life. I moved to a new town, far enough away from the suburbs that I could breathe without feeling like the past was following me. I found a job I loved, working in a small community center where I felt like I was making a difference. It wasn't glamorous, but it was fulfilling in a way that my old life had never been. Slowly but surely, I started to feel like myself again, like I was more than just the sum of my past failures. But even with all the progress I was making, there was still one thing that weighed heavily on my heart. Despite everything, I still wanted to be a mother. It wasn't about fulfilling anyone else's expectations anymore. It was about me. I wanted to experience that kind of love, that kind of connection, even if it wasn't going to happen the way I had originally planned. So, after a lot of soul-searching and research, I decided to try IVF. It wasn't easy. IVF is expensive, emotionally draining, and there were times when I thought it would never work. But last year, after months of trying, I got pregnant. When I held my daughter, Lily, for the first time 4 months ago, it was like my heart had finally found its missing piece. She was perfect in every way, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was truly happy. I thought I had left the past behind me. I had my daughter, my new life, and I was moving forward. But the universe has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. A few weeks ago, I was out for a walk with Lily in her stroller when I saw them, my parents and Ryan. They were visiting Ryan's aunt, who lived in the same neighborhood I had moved to. I hadn't seen or spoken to any of them in 3 years, and suddenly, there they were, standing in front of me, looking just as shocked as I felt. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to turn around and run, but there was another part of me that was tired of running. So, I stood there, frozen, as they approached. They couldn't hide their surprise when they saw Lily. My mother's eyes lit up in a way I hadn't seen since before the infertility news. Ryan looked uncomfortable, like he didn't know what to say, but my parents were full of questions. They wanted to talk, to catch up, to pretend like they cared. It was infuriating. They didn't care about me. They cared about the idea of a grandchild, about reclaiming some part of the life they thought they were owed. Ryan even had the audacity to suggest that maybe this was a sign, that we could try again, that maybe we were meant to have a second chance now that I had a child. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything they had done, after the betrayal and the abandonment, they thought they could just waltz back into my life because I had a baby now. I felt the anger boiling up inside me, years of pent-up frustration, hurt, and betrayal coming to the surface. I told them, in no uncertain terms, that they had no right to be a part of my life anymore. They had made their choice years ago. They had shown me exactly where I stood in their world, and now, just because I had something they wanted, they thought they could claim a place in my life again. I wasn't going to let them use me, or my daughter, as a way to fulfill their selfish desires. I was done. I walked away from them that day, holding my head high, feeling lighter than I had in years. They may have abandoned me when I needed them the most, but I wasn't going to let them steal my happiness now. I had built a new life, a better life, and they were no longer a part of it. And as I pushed Lily's stroller down the street, away from the ghosts of my past, I realized that I didn't need their approval anymore. I was enough, just me and my daughter. And for the first time in a long time, that was all that mattered. After that chance encounter with my parents and Ryan, I felt something inside me snap. For 3 years, I had held it together, kept my emotions in check, built a new life, stayed strong for my own sake and for Lily's. But seeing them, hearing their voices again, their attempts to worm their way back into my life, it was too much. I didn't even realize I had started shouting until I felt my throat burn and saw people on the street staring at me. My emotions erupted right there on the sidewalk, raw and unfiltered. All the anger, the betrayal, the pain that I had buried deep inside came rushing out. I stormed home, pushing Lily's stroller faster than I probably should have, my hands trembling on the handlebar. The moment I stepped through the door, I collapsed on the couch, sobbing. I hadn't cried like that in years. I thought I had moved past all of this, that I had healed. But I guess some wounds never truly close. They just lie there, festering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to burst open again. For the next few days, I couldn't function. I called in sick to work, took time off, and just stayed home with Lily. I needed space. I needed time to process everything. My mind was a mess, spinning with memories and questions. I kept replaying that encounter over and over, wondering what I could have said differently, or if I should have just walked away without engaging at all. But the truth was, I couldn't have. Not after everything they put me through. Then, just as I was starting to feel like I might be able to breathe again, my phone rang. It was an unknown number, and normally, I wouldn't have answered it. But something made me pick up this time. Maybe I thought it was work, or maybe I was just tired of running from everything. Either way, when I answered, I wasn't expecting to hear Ryan's voice on the other end. The moment I heard him speak, my stomach twisted into knots. I should have hung up. I should have blocked the number immediately. But instead, I just sat there, listening as he started talking, trying to explain himself, to explain my parents. He said they had been disappointed when they found out about my infertility, that they didn't know how to handle it. He tried to justify their actions, saying they were just hurt and confused, that they didn't mean to push me away. It was infuriating. The more he talked, the angrier I got. How dare he try to defend them? How dare he make excuses for the people who had abandoned me when I needed them most? But then he said something that caught me off guard. He said my parents had accused me of being the selfish one, that I had been too demanding, too needy after the infertility news, and that was why they distanced themselves. They felt like they couldn't live up to my expectations, that I was asking for too much support. At first, I was furious. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that he had no right to speak for me or my feelings. But then, doubt started creeping in. Had I been too demanding? Was I asking too much from them? I had needed their support, but had I overwhelmed them with my grief? My parents had never been particularly nurturing, but maybe I had expected more from them than they were capable of giving. Was it possible that I had driven them away without realizing it? It was a terrifying thought. For years, I had blamed them for everything, for not being there when I needed them, for abandoning me when I was at my lowest. But now, Ryan was making me question all of it. Was I the problem? Had I been the one who pushed them away? I knew deep down that this was gaslighting. I could feel it. Ryan was twisting the narrative, trying to make me second-guess myself, trying to plant seeds of doubt. But even though I knew it, the doubt still lingered. I couldn't help but wonder if there was some truth to what he was saying. Maybe I had been too emotional, too dependent on them during that time. Maybe I should have handled it differently. The more I thought about it, the more conflicted I felt. But then I remembered something my mother had told me a long time ago, back when I was a child. She had always wanted another baby, a son, but after I was born, she had complications that made it impossible for her to have more children. They had never tried again because it wasn't medically possible. That was why I had always felt like a disappointment to them. They hadn't been able to have the son they wanted, and so I had always been the consolation prize, the child they had to settle for. That realization brought everything into focus. My parents had never wanted me. They had wanted a son, a child who could carry on the family name, someone who could fulfill the dreams they had. But they didn't get that, and they had spent my entire life resenting me for it. The infertility news was just the final nail in the coffin for them. I hadn't driven them away. They had never truly been on my side to begin with. And then there was Ryan. He had grown up in a loving family, the only child of doting parents. He had never known what it was like to be unloved or unwanted. So why had he gotten so close to my parents? Why had he chosen to align himself with them after everything they had done to me? It didn't make sense. I couldn't let it go. I needed answers. I hadn't spoken to Ryan's parents since the divorce, but I decided to reach out to them. They had always been kind to me, and I figured they might have some insight into what had been going on. When I called, they were surprised to hear from me, but they were polite, as always. After some small talk, I asked them about Ryan's relationship with my parents. That's when I learned something that shocked me. Apparently, there had been some sort of falling out between Ryan and his parents a few years ago, around the time we were struggling with infertility. They hadn't told me about it because it was a private matter, but they had eventually reconciled with him. However, during that time, Ryan had gotten closer to my parents. He had found comfort in them, apparently, and had stayed in touch with them even after the divorce. It didn't make sense. Ryan had grown up in a loving home, with parents who cared for him deeply. He hadn't needed my parents' approval or support. So why had he turned to them? Why had he chosen to stay close to the people who had hurt me so badly? As I sat there, trying to make sense of it all, I realized that Ryan's relationship with my parents had always been a way for him to escape dealing with our issues. When things got tough, he hadn't turned to me. He had turned to them. And they, in turn, had latched onto him as the son they never had. It was all starting to come together now, the tangled web of lies, betrayal, and misplaced loyalty. I hung up the phone feeling more confused than ever. Ryan had always seemed so supportive, so loving in the beginning. But now, I realized that his support had been conditional. When things got hard, when I needed him the most, he had checked out. He had found comfort in my parents, the very people who had made me feel so inadequate my whole life. It was a bitter pill to swallow, knowing that the people I had once trusted had all conspired in their own ways to push me aside. But at least now, I understood. I understood why Ryan had filed for divorce so quickly, why my parents had sided with him, why they had all abandoned me when I needed them most. It wasn't about me, it was about them. Their needs, their desires, their inability to deal with reality. As I sat there, processing everything, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was painful, yes, but it was also liberating. For so long, I had blamed myself for everything that had gone wrong. I had carried the weight of their expectations, their disappointments, their anger. But now, I realized that I wasn't responsible for any of it. I had done my best. I had tried to be a good daughter, a good wife. But in the end, it was never enough for them. And that was their failure, not mine. I looked at Lily, sleeping peacefully in her crib, and I knew that I would never let her feel the way my parents had made me feel. She would know that she was loved, that she was enough, just as she was. I would break the cycle. I would raise her in a world where love wasn't conditional, where she didn't have to prove her worth to anyone. And as for Ryan and my parents, they were part of the past now, a past that I was finally ready to leave behind. As I sat with all the pieces of the past scattered in my mind, I began to see how deeply my parents had manipulated everything from the start. It wasn't just their passive indifference or disappointment. It was an active campaign to keep me small, to keep me tethered to their expectations, and Ryan was just another pawn in their twisted game. Looking back, I could see it clearly now, how they had tried to reel him in from the very beginning, how they slowly built that connection behind my back. It started off with small things, things I didn't notice at first. They would invite him over for dinner, sometimes without even telling me. I'd come home from work and find him sitting at their table, sharing a meal, laughing at my father's jokes like they had been friends for years. I told myself it was a good thing. I wanted them to like each other. I wanted my parents to be involved in my life, and if that meant them getting closer to Ryan, so be it. But what I didn't realize was that their relationship with him was evolving into something I wasn't a part of, something that excluded me. It wasn't just dinners, though. There were the gifts, expensive ones that made me uncomfortable, a new watch, designer clothes, things Ryan never would have bought for himself. When I asked him about it, he brushed it off, said it was nothing, that my parents were just being generous. I didn't press the issue, thinking it was harmless, but now I realized that was part of their plan. They were buying his loyalty, little by little, cementing their influence over him in ways I never saw coming. I learned much later that they had even been writing him checks, slipping him money without my knowledge. I was furious when I found out, but by then, it was too late. The damage had been done. Ryan had already been drawn into their world, where their approval mattered more than mine. And that's when things started to go downhill. When we first discussed IVF, I was hesitant. Not because I didn't want to have a child, but because the financial burden was too much for us to handle at the time. I had wanted to wait, to save up, to make sure we were in a stable place before going through with it. But my parents had other ideas. They wanted a grandchild, and they wanted one now. They pressured Ryan relentlessly, offering to pay for the treatments, insisting that we shouldn't wait. Ryan, feeling the weight of their expectations, began to push me too. He didn't tell me about the money they were offering, didn't tell me about the conversations they were having behind my back. All I saw was his growing frustration with my reluctance. He started to make me feel guilty, like I was the one standing in the way of our future, like I was being selfish for wanting to wait. Eventually, it became too much. Ryan wasn't just being influenced by my parents. He was being brainwashed. They had convinced him that he deserved better than someone who was cautious, someone who wasn't willing to take the risks they wanted. And in the end, he believed them. He left, not because of me, not because of anything I had done, but because my parents had manipulated him into thinking that he could have a better life without me. They had poisoned our marriage from the inside out, and Ryan had fallen for it completely. I thought that was the end of it. I thought once the divorce was finalized, once I had moved away and cut contact, that I was free from all of them. But I was wrong. Ryan hadn't truly let go, and neither had my parents. They were still in the background, still whispering in his ear, even though I had made it clear that I wanted nothing to do with them. A few months ago, everything came to a head in the most terrifying way possible. I was just coming back from running errands, on my way home to pick up Lily from the babysitter, when I saw him. Ryan, standing outside my house, shouting, pounding on the door. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Why was he here? What did he want? But then the fear set in as I realized he wasn't just knocking. He was trying to break in. My babysitter had already taken Lily upstairs, out of sight, and called the police. I rushed to the side of the house, hiding behind the bushes, my heart racing as I waited for the sound of sirens. It felt like an eternity, those few minutes. I kept thinking, what if he gets in? What if he finds Lily? What if he hurts her? Or me? The fear was paralyzing, but I knew I had to stay calm. The police arrived just in time, pulling Ryan away before he could do any real damage. He was arrested right there on my front lawn, still screaming, still trying to get to me. I don't know what he wanted, what he thought he was going to accomplish by showing up like that, but whatever it was, it ended with him in handcuffs. I filed for a restraining order the next day. I couldn't take any more chances. I had to protect my daughter. I had to protect myself. In the days that followed, I was bombarded with messages from Ryan's parents. They apologized profusely, told me they had no idea he was capable of something like this, that they had stopped communicating with him after the divorce. Apparently, he had been spiraling ever since we split, struggling with his own issues, and this was the result. It didn't make me feel any better. I didn't care about his struggles anymore. He wasn't my responsibility, and I wasn't about to let him back into my life, no matter what he was going through. My parents, on the other hand, went completely silent. Not a word from them after the incident. I knew they had been pulling strings behind the scenes, but I guess even they couldn't defend what Ryan had done. Maybe they finally realized they had gone too far, or maybe they just didn't want to be involved in the mess they had helped create. Either way, their absence was the final confirmation I needed that they were never really on my side. Despite their silence, I knew they hadn't truly let go. They still had their ways of trying to embarrass me, of trying to make me look like the problem. I heard through the grapevine, extended family, old friends, that they were still spreading their version of events, still trying to paint me as the selfish daughter who had pushed them away. But by this point, it didn't matter. The truth was out there, and the people who knew me, who really knew me, saw through their lies. My parents could gossip all they wanted, but it wouldn't change the fact that they had lost. They had lost me. They had lost any chance of being a part of Lily's life, and that was on them. I thought about my parents a lot during those weeks after the incident with Ryan. I thought about how they had spent their entire lives trying to mold me into someone I wasn't, how they had used me as a means to their own ends. But more than that, I thought about how they had failed. They had wanted control, they had wanted power over my life, but in the end, they had none. I had taken that power back. I had built a life for myself without them, without their approval, without their interference. And that life was better than anything they could have ever imagined for me. I knew, deep down, that they would never change. They would always see me as a disappointment, as the daughter who didn't give them what they wanted. But I also knew that I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't need their validation. I had Lily now, and she was the only family that mattered. My parents and Ryan would never see her. I had made that decision the moment I held her in my arms for the first time. I wasn't going to let them poison her the way they had poisoned me. I wasn't going to let them into her life, only to fill her head with their lies and manipulations. She deserved better than that. She deserved better than them. As for me, I was finally at peace with my decision. I didn't need closure from my parents or from Ryan. I didn't need them to apologize or to admit they were wrong. I had moved on. I had found happiness, real happiness, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. Every day, as I watched Lily grow, I promised myself that I would be the mother I never had. I would love her unconditionally, without expecting anything in return. I would support her, encourage her, let her be whoever she wanted to be. I would never make her feel like she wasn't enough, because she was enough. She was more than enough. And as I sat there, holding her tiny hand in mine, I knew that I was enough too. If you like the story, don't hesitate to subscribe and listen to new stories every day. Write in the comments what you like the most.